The wedding is off. I don't love you anymore. Ethan Cole said it loudly, clearly, with the kind of practiced projection meant to carry past clinking glasses and low conversation, meant to reach every corner of the restaurant. Saturday lunch had been in full swing, the place packed with families, couples, and groups of friends squeezed into polished wooden tables. Forks paused mid-air. Conversations thinned, then stopped altogether. I felt the attention before I saw it, dozens of faces turning in our direction, eyes locking onto the table Ethan had insisted on requesting when we arrived. The table near the center, the visible one. I sat there with my hands resting lightly beside my plate, the words hanging between us like smoke after an explosion. I didn't drop my fork. I didn't gasp. I didn't ask him to repeat himself. What I felt wasn't confusion, it was recognition. Then he did the second thing, the thing that made the air leave my lungs all at once. Ethan reached across the table and took Claire's hand. My sister's hand, Claire Parker. My younger sister, seated beside him, not beside me. He held her fingers with casual familiarity and lifted their joined hands slightly, like a declaration. I love her, he said. I'm choosing her. Claire didn't pull away. She didn't look at me. She didn't look shocked. She looked prepared. And that was the moment I understood this was never meant to be private. I am Lena Parker, and I am 28 years old. Until that Saturday afternoon, I believed I was walking into a routine lunch with my fiancé. Maybe awkward, maybe tense, but ordinary. Ethan had suggested it earlier that week, said it would be nice to get out, said some of his friends would be there too. He framed it as casual, convenient, harmless. I remember hesitating when he mentioned Claire would be joining us. My sister lived nearby, and I assumed he was trying to be thoughtful, trying to make things feel normal with the wedding only months away. The restaurant was busy when we arrived, the kind of place people chose specifically because it buzzed with life. Ethan spoke to the host with a familiarity that struck me as odd in hindsight, requesting a particular table. Not a quiet corner, not near the windows, the center. A table you couldn't ignore without trying. His friends were already there, seated at an adjacent table, smiling and waving as if this were a planned reunion. Claire stood when she saw us, hugging Ethan first, then me second, her arms stiff around my shoulders. At the time, I told myself I was overthinking. I had gotten good at that. We ordered drinks, we exchanged small talk. Ethan barely touched his water. He watched the room instead of me, his gaze flicking between his friends, the surrounding tables, the entrance. Claire sat unusually still, her hands folded in her lap, her smile thin and controlled. I noticed one of Ethan's friends holding his phone face up on the table, screen dark but positioned just so. I noticed another shifting his chair, angling it slightly toward us. None of it registered as danger yet. It felt like static background noise I couldn't quite tune out. Then Ethan cleared his throat. He didn't take my hand. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't lean in. He straightened his back, squared his shoulders, and delivered the words like a statement he had rehearsed. The wedding is off. I don't love you anymore. He didn't say my name. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't pause to see if I was breathing. For a fraction of a second, the entire restaurant went silent. Even the kitchen noise seemed to dull, as if the building itself was listening. I became acutely aware of every sound my body made. The quiet inhale through my nose, the small shift of my chair, the faint clink of ice in someone else's glass. Ethan watched me closely, his eyes sharp, alert, expectant. He was waiting for something. When he took Claire's hand, a ripple moved through the room. I heard someone exhale sharply. I heard a chair scrape against the floor. One of Ethan's friends let out a small, disbelieving laugh, the kind that comes when people aren't sure whether they're allowed to react yet. Another phone lifted, this time more openly. The lens pointed toward me. Claire finally looked at me then, not with guilt, not with fear, with something else. Satisfaction might be too strong a word, but it was close. Her face held a calm I had never seen on her before, a steadiness that told me she had known this moment was coming. She squeezed Ethan's hand once, a subtle signal, and he seemed to relax. I felt a strange stillness settle over me. Not numbness. Clarity. It was as if a lock had clicked open somewhere in my chest. I understood, all at once, that this was not an emotional confession. It was a performance. The table, the timing, the witnesses, the cameras. This wasn't a breakup, it was a demonstration. I set my fork down carefully. "Thank you for being honest," I said. My voice sounded steady, even to me. Ethan blinked. His eyebrows lifted slightly, then knitted together. That wasn't what he'd expected. I reached for my left hand and slid the engagement ring off my finger. The diamond caught the light briefly, a flash of something that had once meant forever. I held it between my fingers for a second, then slipped it into my coat pocket. "I think I'll be throwing a narrow escape party," I continued, more to myself than to anyone else. "That feels appropriate." There was a beat of stunned silence. Then someone at the other table snorted. A couple of Ethan's friends laughed, the sound sharp and uncertain. Ethan's mouth curved into a smirk, relief flickering across his face. He thought I was deflecting. He thought I hadn't understood. "Lena," he said, his tone shifting, edged now. "Did you hear what I said?" "I heard you perfectly," I replied. "You don't love me anymore. The wedding is off. You're choosing my sister." Claire's fingers tightened around his. I pulled my wallet from my bag and placed cash on the table, enough to cover my meal and a generous tip for the server, who stood frozen a few steps away, eyes wide. "You chose an interesting setting for this," I added, standing up. "A crowded restaurant, your friends nearby, very public." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I thought you deserved the truth." "And you gave it," I said simply, "more than you meant to." I glanced at his friends, men who had nodded along to this plan, who had agreed to be here. Their expressions had shifted now, amusement draining away, replaced by confusion. "Thank you for coming," I said, nodding politely. "Your presence has been illuminating." As I walked toward the exit, I felt the weight of every gaze in the room pressing against my back. But there was no shame in it, no collapse, just clarity. 4 years. I had given Ethan 4 years of my life, and in one carefully staged moment, he had shown me exactly who he was. The afternoon light hit my face as I stepped outside. I inhaled deeply, the air cool and clean compared to the stifling quiet I'd left behind. My hands weren't shaking. My eyes were dry. I walked to my car with measured steps, unlocked the door, and sat behind the wheel. Only then did I let myself process what had happened. Not devastation. Recognition. The man I had planned to marry had not just ended our relationship. He had attempted to dismantle me in front of an audience. He had expected tears, anger, pleading. He had expected proof. My phone buzzed in my bag. I didn't need to look to know who it was. When I finally did, the message read, "That wasn't the reaction I expected. We need to talk." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I locked the phone, placed it face down on the passenger seat, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I caught a glimpse of the restaurant through the rear-view mirror. Ethan was still at the table, his friends clustered around him now. He was talking animatedly, gesturing with his hands. Explaining, I realized. Rewriting. He had no idea what he had just handed me. That lunch wasn't a breakup, it was a setup, and I had just refused to play my part. I sat in my car long after the engine started, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the steady hum as if it might tell me how I was supposed to feel. My chest wasn't tight, my throat wasn't closing. There was no rush of tears blurring my vision. Instead, there was a sharp, almost uncomfortable alertness, like every nerve in my body had woken up at once. I wasn't in shock. I was aware. That realization came slowly, settling in as I replayed the scene in my mind. Ethan's posture, his voice, the way his eyes kept darting past me instead of into me. He hadn't been bracing himself for an emotional conversation. He had been monitoring an audience. When I stood up from the table, I remembered the exact moment his confidence cracked, just for a second. Not when I removed the ring, not when I thanked him, but when I didn't give him anything loud enough to justify what he had done. I put the car in drive and pulled onto the street, traffic flowing around me like nothing monumental had just happened. Portland moved on. People crossed streets. Someone laughed on the sidewalk. The world didn't stop because my life had been publicly dismantled, and that felt strangely grounding. My phone buzzed again. That wasn't the reaction I expected. "We need to talk." I didn't answer. I didn't feel the familiar spike of anxiety, the urge to smooth things over, to clarify my tone, to reassure him I wasn't angry. I noticed that absence like a missing limb. For 4 years, my first instinct after any tension with Ethan had been to manage his discomfort. Now the instinct was gone. A few minutes later, another message appeared. "This isn't like you." I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, but because it was revealing. He wasn't confused by what had happened. He was confused by who I was being. Or rather, who I wasn't being. "You're in shock," the next message read. "Call me when you've calmed down." There it was, the language he always used when I didn't respond the way he wanted. Calm down. As if any reaction he couldn't control must be irrational. As if my emotions were something he could diagnose from afar. I let the phone sit on the seat beside me, screen lighting up with each new vibration, and focused on the road instead. By the time I reached my apartment, 3 more messages had come through, all variations of the same theme. "You need time. You're overwhelmed. We should talk like adults." He was narrating my internal state for me, building the explanation in real time. It struck me then that he wasn't asking how I felt because it didn't matter. What mattered was whether my behavior aligned with the story he had already prepared. Inside my apartment, the silence felt different from the silence in the restaurant. This one wasn't oppressive. It was neutral. I set my bag down, slipped off my shoes, and leaned against the door for a moment, breathing. My reflection stared back at me from the mirror across the room. My face was pale, but composed. My eyes were clear. I thought about what Ethan had expected. Tears. Questions. Anger loud enough for the cameras to catch. He had wanted a reaction that could be replayed, dissected, shown to others as proof. Proof that he was right to leave. Proof that I was exactly as emotional, unstable, and difficult as he had been hinting for months. The public setting hadn't been chosen for convenience. It had been chosen for documentation. That understanding settled heavily in my chest. My phone buzzed again. "People are asking what happened. You need to help me explain this properly." There it was, the real concern, not my well-being, not the damage done, the narrative. He needed me to cooperate so he could finish the story cleanly. I imagined him sitting with his friends now, phones in hand, replaying footage that didn't match the outcome they'd anticipated. No tears, no raised voice, no collapse. Just a woman calmly standing up and walking away. I opened the message thread, typed 3 words, then erased them. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and walked into the living room instead. For the first time since the lunch, my thoughts drifted to Claire. It was impossible not to replay her silence. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the deliberate absence of reaction. She hadn't said my name. She hadn't asked me to wait. She hadn't looked startled or guilty. She had held Ethan's hand as if it belonged there, as if she had practiced the gesture. I sank onto the couch and closed my eyes, replaying smaller moments I had brushed off before. The way Claire had started dropping by unannounced over the past few months. The way she had asked questions about my relationship that felt oddly specific. The way she had defended Ethan when I once mentioned feeling dismissed, telling me I was probably overthinking it. "You can be intense sometimes, Lena." She had smiled when she said it, as if it were sisterly concern. My phone buzzed again. "This silent treatment is immature." That message landed differently than the others. Not because it was harsher, but because it revealed impatience. He wasn't worried, he was irritated. I realized then that my silence wasn't confusing him. It was threatening him. Silence meant I wasn't feeding the machine. I wasn't giving him the emotional material he needed to support his version of events. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my laptop and stared at the blank screen, not to write, not to search, just to ground myself. My mind kept circling back to one question. Why did he need this to be public? If he wanted to leave me for Claire, he could have done it privately. Cruelly, yes, but quietly. There had been no logistical reason for witnesses, cameras, or a crowded room, unless privacy wasn't the goal, unless the goal was proof. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights beginning to flicker on as dusk settled. Somewhere out there, Ethan was still talking, still explaining, still crafting a version of events where he emerged reasonable and justified. I knew the language he would use because I had heard echoes of it before. She's been emotional lately. I didn't know how else to do it. I was afraid of how she'd react. Fear. That word would be central to his story. Fear made him look cautious, even noble. Fear shifted responsibility away from the way he had orchestrated the moment. And fear only worked if I behaved the way he had predicted. Another message came through. This isn't healthy, Lena. Avoiding the conversation just proves my point. I exhaled slowly. There it was. The attempt to corner me into validating his narrative. If I stayed silent, I was unstable. If I spoke, I was emotional. Every path he offered led back to the same conclusion. I picked up my phone, opened the settings, and muted the conversation. The quiet that followed felt deliberate, chosen, powerful. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the small kitchen table, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. As I drank, I thought about all the times over the past 4 years when Ethan had told me what other people supposedly thought of me. My friends worry you get too attached. My colleague thinks you're sensitive. Even my mother, he'd said once, asked if you were okay. I had never questioned where those impressions came from. I had assumed they were organic, that I needed to adjust myself accordingly. It hadn't occurred to me that Ethan might be the source, that he might have been planting seeds long before he ever planned to leave. The idea was unsettling, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. If the story had been written in advance, then my confusion hadn't been a personal failure. It had been engineered. Later that evening, my phone buzzed again, this time with a different name. A mutual acquaintance. Someone who had been at the restaurant. "Are you okay?" she wrote. "That looked rough." I stared at the message for a moment. Then I typed back, "I'm fine, just processing." The response came quickly. "That's not what Ethan said. He said you were having a hard time." My fingers hovered over the screen. I could feel the fork in the road opening up in front of me. I could correct her. I could explain. I could start dismantling his narrative piece by piece. Or I could do nothing. I chose the third option. I replied. I walked out calmly. "You were there." There was a pause. Several minutes passed. Then a new message appeared. "Yeah," she wrote. "You did." I set the phone down and felt something shift again, smaller this time, but just as significant. The truth didn't need a performance. It only needed contrast. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I finally understood why my reaction at the restaurant had mattered so much. Ethan hadn't just wanted to leave me. He wanted to leave with evidence. Evidence that he was justified. Evidence that his new beginning with my sister wasn't cruel but necessary. By refusing to fall apart, I had taken something from him he couldn't get back. He didn't want freedom. He wanted justification. And I had just denied him both. I woke up the next morning expecting to feel hollow. That was what breakups were supposed to do, wasn't it? Leave you staring at the ceiling, heart racing, mind spiraling. Instead, I woke with a dull ache behind my eyes, and a heaviness in my chest that felt less like grief and more like vigilance, as if some part of me had stayed awake all night, standing guard. My phone lay face down on the nightstand. I didn't reach for it right away. For years, the first thing I had done every morning was check for messages from Ethan. Did he sleep well? Was he annoyed? Did I need to fix something before the day even began? That reflex was still there, twitching, but I didn't obey it. When I finally turned the phone over, the screen lit up with notifications. 7 missed messages from Ethan, 2 missed calls, 1 voicemail, and then a new name. Claire. Seeing my sister's name tightened something deep in my stomach. I hadn't heard from her since the restaurant. Not a text, not an apology, not even a confused explanation. Just silence. Deliberate, calculated silence. I opened Ethan's messages first, skimming without really reading. The tone had shifted overnight. Less controlling, more pleading. He wanted to clear the air. He wanted to talk things through. He wanted me to understand where he was coming from. Every sentence centered himself, his discomfort, his frustration that the situation hadn't resolved cleanly. I deleted the voicemail without listening to it. Then I opened Claire's message. Can we talk today? I think things got out of hand yesterday. Out of hand. As if the situation had slipped accidentally, like a glass knocked off a counter, as if it hadn't been choreographed down to the seating arrangement. I set the phone down and went to make coffee, needing the small ritual to anchor myself. As the machine hissed and sputtered, memories I hadn't invited began surfacing, moments involving Claire that now felt different under this new light. She had always been the softer one, at least on the surface, the younger sister, the peacemaker, the one who smiled through discomfort and avoided confrontation. Growing up, I had often stepped in front of her, taken the harder stance, absorbed the tension so she wouldn't have to. That dynamic had followed us into adulthood. I protected. She adapted. Or so I had believed. I carried my coffee to the window and stared out at the street below. A delivery truck idled at the curb. Someone jogged past, earbuds in, unaware of the quiet earthquake that had fractured my family the day before. The ordinariness of it all felt surreal. I thought about Claire's face in the restaurant, not startled, not conflicted, prepared. That expression hadn't been born in the moment. It was the face of someone stepping into a role she had rehearsed. The phone buzzed again. Claire this time. Please, Lena. I don't want this to turn into something bigger than it already is. Something bigger. As if it weren't already devastating. As if my engagement hadn't been publicly dismantled. As if she hadn't held my fiancé's hand while he did it. I typed a reply. Erased it. Typed again. Did you know before yesterday? The 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Then disappeared. Then appeared again. I set the phone down and waited. Minutes passed. Finally, a message came through. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. My chest tightened. I stared at the words, reading them over and over. Not no, not I'm sorry, not I didn't know. Just a vague deflection that confirmed everything without saying it outright. So you did know, I typed. This time, the response took longer. Ethan and I didn't plan to hurt you, she wrote. Things just evolved. The word felt slippery, designed to erase responsibility, as if betrayal were a natural process, like weather. I took a slow breath. You sat next to him, I wrote. You let him do it. You held his hand. I could almost see her reading that, weighing her words, choosing the version of herself she wanted to present. He said it was the only way, she replied. He said if he did it privately, you'd take it badly. There it was. The narrative. I closed my eyes, a bitter laugh escaping my throat before I could stop it. He said I'd take it badly. And you believed him. Another pause. He's been worried about you for a while, Lena. You've been under a lot of stress. I felt the shift then, the moment when confusion turned into something sharper. This wasn't just justification, it was alignment. Claire wasn't defending herself. She was defending the story Ethan had been telling. I typed carefully. Did you ever think to ask me? No response. I imagined her now, phone in hand, face pinched with concern, rehearsing the same tone she'd used on me for months. Gentle, reasonable, patronizing. The tone that said, "I'm only worried about you," while quietly positioning me as the problem. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call from my mother. I hesitated before answering, bracing myself. "Hi, Mom." Her voice was tight. "Lena, honey, are you okay?" The question hit harder than I expected. Not because it was intrusive, but because it was genuine. She wasn't diagnosing me. She wasn't assuming. She was asking. "I'm okay," I said. "I really am." There was a pause on the line. "Claire called me last night." Of course she did. She said things happened quickly, that Ethan realized his feelings and didn't know how else to handle it. My mother sighed softly. She sounded upset. I'm sure she did. "Lena," my mother said carefully, "I need to ask you something. Did you have any idea this was coming?" "No," I said, "but I have an idea how long it's been planned." Another pause, heavier this time. "What do you mean?" I told her about the restaurant, the table, the friends. The phone I'd seen lifted. The way Ethan had spoken, not like a man confessing something painful, but like someone delivering a prepared speech. I told her about Claire's message, about the justification already forming. My mother was quiet for a long time. "That's not," she began, then stopped. "That's not how someone behaves if they're trying to be kind." "No," I agreed, "it's not." "She keeps saying you're fragile," my mother admitted, "that this was the only way." The word fragile echoed in my head, clicking into place alongside emotional, sensitive, intense. "He's been telling people that for months," I said quietly. My mother exhaled slowly. "I wondered," she said. "I wondered if that was coming from him." After we hung up, I sat on the couch staring at the blank television screen. My reflection looked back at me, still composed, still upright. The contrast between how I felt and how they described me was jarring. According to their version, I was unraveling. According to reality, I was functioning, thinking, connecting dots. The phone buzzed again. "Ethan, we need to talk about what you're telling people, Lena. This is getting out of control. Out of control." The phrase made my jaw tighten. He had lost control and he didn't like it. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my laptop and began scrolling through old photos stored in the cloud. Family gatherings, holidays, group shots with Ethan's friends. Claire appeared in more of them than I remembered, standing close, laughing too freely, looking at Ethan when she thought no one was watching. I wasn't searching for proof yet. I wasn't ready for that. I was searching for context, for the moments I had missed because I hadn't been looking for betrayal where I assumed loyalty. A memory surfaced, unbidden. A few months ago, Claire had joked at dinner, "If things don't work out between you two, I call dibs." Everyone had laughed, including me. Ethan had laughed too, a little too loudly. At the time, I'd brushed it off as inappropriate humor. Now it felt like a rehearsal. By afternoon, messages had started trickling in from extended family. Confused, concerned, curious. The story was already spreading, shaped by whoever spoke first. I answered politely, briefly. I didn't explain. I didn't defend myself. I simply said, "I'm taking some space." Every time I did, the response was the same. "That makes sense. Take care of yourself. We're here if you need anything." No one accused me of being unstable. No one suggested I was overreacting. The disconnect between Ethan's warnings and people's actual reactions grew wider with every exchange. That evening, Claire called again. I let it ring. A voicemail followed, her voice wavering just enough to sound sincere. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said. I thought he knew what he was doing." I deleted it without replying. For the first time, I allowed myself to name it clearly. This wasn't just betrayal by a partner. It was betrayal by family. Claire hadn't been caught in the crossfire. She had stepped into the line of fire willingly, trusting Ethan's narrative over her own sister's reality. And in doing so, she had revealed something I hadn't wanted to see. She hadn't just chosen him. She had chosen the story where I was the problem. As night fell, I sat alone with the lights off, the city glowing faintly through the window. My phone remained silent now, as if everyone was recalibrating, reassessing. I could feel the ground shifting beneath the version of events Ethan had tried to cement. I understood then that what happened at the restaurant wasn't the end of something. It was the opening move. And for the first time since that Saturday lunch, I felt something unmistakably solid take root in my chest. Resolve. If they had planned this together, then the truth would unravel them together. I didn't sleep that night. Not because my mind was racing, but because it wouldn't stop replaying things I had already lived through and dismissed. Moments that had once felt small now returned with weight, lining up in a way that made them impossible to ignore. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't heartbreak. It was analysis. By morning, I understood something that shifted everything. What happened at the restaurant wasn't the end of my relationship with Ethan. It was the moment I finally saw what that relationship had always been. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, notebook open but untouched. I wasn't trying to write anything down yet. I was letting the memories come, one by one, without interrupting them, without softening their edges the way I used to. I thought back to the first time I met Ethan. It was at a networking event downtown, one of those after-work mixers with bad wine and forced smiles. I had gone with a coworker, planning to stay 30 minutes at most. Ethan approached me with confidence that felt effortless. He asked where I worked, what I liked about it, what I wanted to do next. He listened closely, nodding at all the right places. When I talked about my ideas, my frustrations, he didn't interrupt. He remembered details, he followed up. At the time, I thought it meant he cared. Now I realized it meant he was collecting information. Ethan had always been good at asking questions that made people feel seen, but they weren't open-ended. They guided. He learned what motivated you, what unsettled you, what you needed validation for. He didn't mirror me, he mapped me. I remembered something he'd said on our third date, smiling like it was a compliment. I like that you're driven, but you don't always know when to stop. Someone needs to ground you. I had laughed then, told him he was probably right. The memory made my jaw tighten. The early months of our relationship had been full of what I thought were compromises. He didn't like my friends much, said they were immature, negative, not really aligned with where I was headed. I started seeing them less, not all at once, just gradually. He thought my apartment was inconvenient, too far from his office, too cramped. I moved. He questioned whether my career path was stable enough long-term. I adjusted my expectations. Each change felt reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I hadn't wanted to name. The giving had always been mine. When I pushed back, Ethan never argued outright. He didn't need to. He had a subtler way of winning. He'd sigh, rub his temples, tell me he was just worried, that I took things too personally, that I was reading into things that weren't there. "You're sensitive," he'd say gently. "That's not a bad thing. You just have to be aware of it." Aware. As if my emotions were something to manage, not something to respect. I remembered the first time he corrected me in public. It was at a dinner party with his colleagues. I mispronounced a word, barely noticeable, but Ethan jumped in immediately, laughing as he corrected me, placing a hand on my back like he was steadying me. Everyone laughed politely. I felt heat rise to my face. Later, when I told him it embarrassed me, he looked genuinely surprised. "I was helping you," he said. "Why are you making this into something?" I apologized. The realization settled heavily now. I had been apologizing for my own discomfort for years. As the morning stretched on, more memories surfaced, sharper this time. Compliments that came with conditions. Praise in public, criticism in private. Plans he made without consulting me, followed by wounded looks when I expressed frustration. "You always assume the worst," he'd say. "Why can't you just trust me?" Trust. Another word he had redefined to suit himself. I thought about money. Ethan earned more than I did, and he never let me forget it. Not overtly, but through implication. He paid for expensive dinners, luxury trips, things I hadn't asked for. When I suggested splitting costs or choosing something simpler, he'd wave it off. "Let me handle it," he'd say. "You don't need to worry about that." What he meant was, you don't get to decide. At the time, I told myself I was lucky. Now I saw the strings attached to every gesture, financial dependence dressed up as generosity. The engagement came sooner than I'd expected. Ethan proposed at his parents' anniversary party in front of their entire extended family. 200 people, phones raised, applause erupting before I'd even processed what was happening. I said yes because saying anything else would have required a scene. That should have been my warning. Ethan loved an audience. He loved moments that made him look decisive, romantic, in control. The proposal hadn't been about us. It had been about optics. The wedding planning only confirmed it. I wanted something small, intimate. He wanted scale. He wanted influence. He wanted people to see him succeed, to see his life progressing the way it was supposed to. Every disagreement ended the same way. "This isn't just about you, Lena," he'd say. "It's about our future." Our future. Always singular, always shaped around his needs. I closed my eyes, the pieces aligning with a clarity that made my chest ache. Ethan hadn't fallen out of love with me suddenly. He hadn't woken up one morning and realized his feelings had changed. He had outgrown the version of me he could control. Somewhere along the way, I had started questioning more, pushing back, even subtly, wanting space again, reconnecting with people he didn't approve of. I hadn't noticed the shift, but he had, and instead of adjusting, he had replaced me. Claire wasn't the reason he left. She was the solution he chose. My sister was different. She didn't challenge. She adapted easily. She wanted to be chosen. She fit into the role Ethan needed filled, the woman who wouldn't question the narrative, who wouldn't threaten his carefully constructed image. I remembered moments now that made my stomach turn. Ethan praising Claire for qualities he had once attributed to me, saying she was easy to talk to, that she didn't overthink things, that she was refreshingly uncomplicated. At the time, I'd told myself I was being paranoid. Now I saw the transition for what it was. The restaurant wasn't the beginning, it was the finale. Ethan had needed witnesses because he wasn't just ending a relationship. He was launching a story, one where he was patient, brave, and justified, one where I was emotional, unstable, someone he had been forced to leave for his own well-being. The public humiliation wasn't cruelty for its own sake, it was strategy. I thought back to something he'd said once, casually, after a friend of his went through a messy breakup. "People need to see things for themselves," Ethan had remarked. "Otherwise, they make up their own version." That sentence echoed now with chilling clarity. The reason my calm had unsettled him wasn't because he cared. It was because it disrupted the script. Without my meltdown, his story lacked evidence. Without my breakdown, his justification looked hollow. I stood up and paced the apartment, the weight of understanding pressing down on me. This wasn't about love lost. This was about power reclaimed, just not by him. I stopped in front of the mirror and studied my reflection again. I didn't look broken. I looked alert, focused, like someone who had just stepped out of a fog and realized how long she'd been walking blind. For the first time, I stopped asking myself what I could have done differently. The answer was nothing. I hadn't failed to keep him. I had outgrown the role he assigned me. That was when a new thought surfaced, quiet but insistent. If Ethan had planned the ending so carefully, if he had prepared witnesses, language, even Claire's participation, then this wasn't something he decided weeks ago. It had been building for months, maybe longer, and if that was true, then the lunch wasn't the only thing he'd prepared. I walked back to the table and opened my laptop, not with panic, but with intention. I wasn't searching for closure, I was searching for context, for timelines, for patterns. I didn't know yet what I would find, But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was done remembering. Now, I was going to start looking. I didn't open my laptop with anger. That surprised me. I opened it the way you open a drawer you've avoided for a long time, not because you're afraid of what's inside, but because you already know something is there and you're finally ready to see it clearly. I wasn't looking for an apology. I wasn't looking for proof that Ethan loved me once. I was looking for a timeline. People who plan exits always leave traces. They get careless when they think the story is already decided. And Ethan had never imagined I'd stop crying long enough to pay attention. The familiar glow of my inbox filled the screen. Shared calendars, shared cloud storage, documents we'd both touched during wedding planning. Everything still open to me. Ethan hadn't changed a single password. Not because he trusted me, because he underestimated me. I started with the calendar. At first, nothing looked strange. Meetings, dinners, family obligations. Then I began noticing overlaps. Appointments Ethan had labeled vaguely. Coffee. Catch up. No names attached. Always during hours he knew I'd be at work. Always recurring. I clicked into one and scrolled back. The first entry appeared 5 months ago. 5 months. My chest tightened, but my hand stayed steady. I opened my email next, filtering by dates, then by keywords. Names, locations, nothing explicit at first. Ethan had always been careful with language. He preferred implication, plausible deniability. That was when I found the folder I didn't recognize. It wasn't hidden, it wasn't password protected. It was just there, sitting among shared wedding files and budget spreadsheets, labeled blandly enough to escape notice. Priority updates. The name alone made my stomach drop. I clicked it open. Inside was a document. Simple, organized, a list of names with notes beside them. Ethan's friends, his colleagues, a few extended family members, people whose opinions mattered to him. Next to each name was a single line. Wedding update. Send immediately. I scrolled to the top of the page and checked the creation date. 2 weeks before the restaurant. The air seemed to leave the room all at once. Not in a rush, in a slow, hollow pull. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't emotional. This was logistics. My phone buzzed on the counter, but I didn't look at it. I didn't need the distraction. I opened the document history. The first draft was shorter, the second more polished. By the final version, the language was smooth, measured, almost compassionate. As some of you witnessed today, I made the difficult decision to end my engagement to Lena. This wasn't easy, but I realized I couldn't commit to a future that no longer aligned with my values and goals. I appreciate your support during this time and ask that you respect my need for privacy as I move forward. I read it twice. It painted him as thoughtful, reluctant, noble, and it painted me as the problem without ever saying my name in a negative way. Misaligned, unstable by implication. Someone he had to escape. I closed the document and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The restaurant flashed through my mind again. The way he'd said the words. Loud enough to be recorded. Clear enough to be replayed. I hadn't imagined it. This was a campaign. I forced myself to keep going. Next, the shared message threads. I searched Ethan's name within group chats I'd rarely paid attention to, threads he said were just work friends or old college buddies. The messages weren't subtle. Today's the day. Meet at the restaurant at 12:30. I want you there to witness. Witness. My fingers curled against the edge of the desk. Another message followed. This is going to be good. Someone responded with a laughing emoji. Another wrote, finally. Been waiting for this. And then the one that made my hands start to shake despite my efforts. I'll record everything. I sat very still, the words pulsing on the screen. There it was. The reason for the phones, the angles, the audience. He hadn't wanted witnesses for support. He'd wanted documentation. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. Not because I was about to cry, because I needed to stay present. I scrolled further back. The messages didn't start that week. They didn't even start that month. There were comments sprinkled throughout the past year. Jokes about me being intense, remarks about Ethan needing patience, suggestions that he deserved someone easier. He had been curating his exit for a long time. My phone buzzed again. I glanced at the screen. Ethan. I ignored it. Instead, I searched a different name. Claire. At first, nothing appeared. Then I broadened the parameters. Calendar invites, emails, shared location history from trips we'd taken together. The pattern emerged quickly. Private meetings, coffee dates, walks labeled vaguely, too vague. Then I found the message thread. It wasn't long. It didn't need to be. I know this is hard. I've been patient. I can't wait until we don't have to hide anymore. The message was dated the night before the restaurant. I stared at it, the words blurring for just a second. Not because I was crying, but because my eyes burned. Another message followed, sent early that morning. Today changes everything. My sister had known. Not suspected, not guessed. Known. I closed the laptop and pressed my palms flat against the desk, grounding myself. The betrayal settled deeper now, heavier than anything Ethan had done. Claire hadn't been swept up in something sudden. She had been waiting for it. When I opened the laptop again, I felt different, more focused, less shocked. I checked our shared phone plan records next, something I'd never bothered with before. I didn't have access to the content of messages, but I didn't need it. The call logs were enough. Ethan's number, Claire's number, repeated, regular, increasing in frequency over the past 5 months. Long calls. Late nights. Gaps in our time together I'd attributed to work stress. The story filled itself in without effort. This wasn't an affair born of confusion. It was cultivated, managed, timed. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Ethan appeared, sharp this time. I don't understand why you're ignoring me. This isn't healthy behavior. I let out a breath that was almost a laugh. He still thought silence was something I owed him an explanation for. I typed one sentence. I'm not ignoring you. I'm just no longer interested in conversations that serve your needs at the expense of my own. The response came almost immediately. That's cold. I expected more from you. I locked my phone and set it aside. Cold. That was his final attempt to shame me back into compliance, but the words slid off me now. I finally understood the shape of the trap he'd built. If I reacted emotionally, he'd have evidence. If I reacted logically, he'd call me cruel. If I stayed silent, he'd label me unstable. The outcome didn't change unless I refused the game entirely. I returned to the documents, organizing what I'd found. Not obsessively, methodically, timelines, screenshots, dates, names. I wasn't planning to expose anything publicly. Not yet. I wasn't interested in revenge that looked like desperation. I was interested in truth that could stand on its own. As I worked, something unexpected happened. The fear I'd carried for years began to loosen. Not all at once, just enough for me to breathe differently. Ethan hadn't broken me. He'd revealed himself, and in doing so, he'd given me something I hadn't realized I needed. Clarity. By the time the sun dipped low in the sky, my laptop was closed again. The evidence was there. The timeline was undeniable. But more important than any document was the realization forming quietly in my chest. If Ethan and Claire had planned this so carefully, then reacting loudly was exactly what they wanted. They needed me to fall apart. They needed me to confirm the story they'd already told. I stood and walked to the window, watching the city settle into evening. Somewhere out there, they were probably waiting, watching, listening for cracks. They weren't going to get them. Because now that I knew the truth, I understood something else just as clearly. The most powerful move I could make wasn't exposure. It was restraint. And I had just decided to take something back that Ethan had assumed was his. The story. I opened the document again the next morning, the one titled so innocently it almost made me laugh. What to say if she reacts badly? The words stared back at me, calm and professional, as if they belonged in a corporate crisis manual rather than the autopsy of a 4-year relationship. I read it slowly this time, not skimming, not bracing myself, but letting every line land. If she cries, emphasize concern. If she raises her voice, remain calm and note her instability. If she accuses, remind people this decision was made for everyone's well-being. If she walks away, say she needs time to process. Every possible version of me had already been written, every reaction pre-framed. There was no scenario in which I emerged as credible, rational, or wronged. The outcome was fixed. I would be unstable. He would be patient. That was the story. I closed my laptop and sat back, a cold clarity spreading through my chest. This wasn't just about ending an engagement. This was about destroying my credibility. I thought about the language Ethan had used in the days since the restaurant. "You're not acting like yourself. This isn't healthy. I'm worried about you." The words weren't random. They were rehearsed, lifted straight from the script he'd prepared. I replayed past conversations with new ears. Remember when he'd told me his coworkers thought I seemed distant? When he'd said my friends didn't really understand me? When he'd mentioned my mother once asked if I was overwhelmed? I'd swallowed those comments whole, believing they reflected concern from others. Now I understood. He had been planting seeds. Gaslighting doesn't always come as lies. Sometimes it comes as consensus. As the quiet suggestion that everyone sees something wrong with you. So maybe you should too. I stood and paced the apartment, the pieces clicking together with a sickening precision. The reason Ethan needed witnesses at the restaurant wasn't to support him. It was to validate the story he'd been telling in advance. He needed people to see me react so he could say, "See, this is what I've been dealing with." And when I didn't react, when I stood up calmly and walked away, the script collapsed. That was why he kept texting. Why his tone shifted from confidence to irritation to concern. He needed me to do something, anything, cry, yell, beg, post something dramatic online, give him proof. Instead, I had given him silence. My phone buzzed again, as if on cue. People are starting to ask questions. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Harder for him, not for me. I set the phone down and returned to the messages between Ethan and Claire, reading them again with a different focus. Not on the betrayal itself, but on the role she played. Claire hadn't just known. She had participated. One message stood out now more than before, sent weeks prior. "I think people will understand if they see it for themselves. Just make sure you're gentle." Gentle. Claire had framed herself as the concerned sister, the reasonable replacement. She wasn't just stepping into my place romantically. She was stepping into my place narratively. The sane one, the calm one, the woman who could support Ethan through the difficulty of leaving someone like me. My stomach twisted. I remembered her telling our mother that I'd been stressed lately, that I seemed tired, that maybe wedding planning was getting to me. I'd thought it was care. I'd thought she was looking out for me. She was laying groundwork. The realization hurt more than I expected. Not sharply, but deeply, like something tearing that had once been stitched too tightly. I sat back down at the table and opened my notebook for the first time. Not to vent, not to journal, to outline. I wrote one word at the top of the page, narrative. Underneath it, I drew 2 columns. Theirs, mine. Under theirs, I wrote the words Ethan and Claire had already been using. Unstable, emotional, overwhelmed, fragile, difficult, under stress, needs time. Under mine, I wrote only facts. Public breakup, witnesses invited, phones recording, prepared messages, prior relationship, silence afterward. No adjectives, no interpretation, just truth. I stared at the page until something clicked. If I responded emotionally, I would be filling in their column for them. If I defended myself loudly, I would look reactive. If I stayed silent without purpose, they would control the empty space. But silence with intention, silence paired with consistency, that unsettled everything. The next message from Ethan arrived mid-afternoon. "You can't just disappear, Lena. That's not how adults handle things." I smiled then, a small, humorless curve of my mouth. Adults. He loved that word when he wanted obedience dressed up as maturity. I typed one response. "I'm not disappearing. I'm choosing not to participate in a story that isn't true." His reply came instantly. "You're proving my point." There it was again, the trap snapping shut. Anything I did was evidence against me. I didn't respond. Instead, I muted his number entirely. The quiet that followed was startling in its completeness. No buzzing, no flashing screen, no pull toward explanation. For the first time since the restaurant, my mind felt steady. That evening I went for a walk. The city moved around me, unaware of the war playing out in text threads and shared documents. Couples passed by holding hands. A woman laughed loudly with her friends outside a bar. Somewhere, music drifted from an open window. I realized then how much of my life with Ethan had been spent anticipating his reactions, editing myself, adjusting my tone, making sure I was never too much of anything. Angry, sad, excited, ambitious. Too much had always been the accusation. I stopped at a crosswalk and waited for the light to change, the sound of traffic humming around me. A thought surfaced, quiet but sharp. They planned my breakdown, not because they cared about my emotions, but because they needed my collapse to justify their choices. When I didn't give it to them, they were left exposed. That was why Ethan was panicking. That was why Claire had gone quiet. Their story required my participation, and I had withdrawn my consent. Back at my apartment, I sat on the couch with the notebook again. I added another line beneath the columns. Strategy. I didn't write anything under it yet. I didn't need to. The shape of it was already forming in my mind. If I couldn't confront them directly without reinforcing their narrative, then I needed a different kind of response. One that didn't accuse. One that didn't explain. One that simply showed. I thought back to the moment in the restaurant, the words that had slipped out of me instinctively. A narrow escape party. At the time, it had been a deflection, a way to keep my dignity intact, but now it felt like something else, a possibility. A celebration didn't fit their story, joy didn't fit instability, calm didn't fit fragility. The idea settled in my chest, not fully formed yet, but solid enough to feel its weight. My phone remained silent all evening. I knew Ethan would try again tomorrow. I knew Claire would eventually reach out when the pressure became too uncomfortable. They both needed something from me. They weren't going to get it. Before going to bed, I wrote one final line in the notebook, under the word strategy. They don't know I know. I closed the notebook and turned off the light. For the first time since Saturday, I slept. And when I did, it wasn't the sleep of someone avoiding reality. It was the rest of someone preparing for what came next. Silence changed the air around me. It wasn't the empty, awkward kind Ethan accused me of using. It was heavy, intentional, the kind that made other people lean forward, squint, and start filling the gaps themselves. I could feel it working even before anyone said anything out loud. By the third day, Ethan's messages had shifted again. The sharp edge dulled into something tighter, more frantic. This isn't like you. People are worried. We should handle this like adults. I read them without reacting, noticing the pattern the way you notice weather changes once you know a storm is coming. He wasn't asking me how I felt. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't even angry anymore. He was unsettled. Silence was disrupting the structure he'd built. I thought about how many times over the years I'd rushed to fill silence for him. How quickly I'd explained myself when he went quiet. How uncomfortable I'd become when conversations paused too long, scrambling to fix whatever I assumed I'd broken. Ethan thrived on that reflex. It gave him leverage. Without it, he didn't know where he stood. On the fourth morning, I woke up to no new messages at all. That absence felt louder than the buzz of my phone ever had. It told me he was recalculating, figuring out his next move. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, notebook open beside me. The words I'd written the night before stared back. They don't know I know. It wasn't a threat. It was an advantage. I didn't plan revenge the way people imagine it. There were no dramatic speeches forming in my head, no fantasies of exposing them publicly and watching them crumble. That kind of reaction would give Ethan exactly what he wanted. It would let him point and say, "See? This is what I meant. I wasn't interested in confirming his narrative. I was interested in dismantling it. That was when I remembered the moment at the restaurant more clearly than before. Not Ethan's words, not Claire's silence, my own voice. I think I'll be throwing a narrow escape party. At the time, it had been instinct, a deflection sharp enough to protect my dignity when everything else was being stripped away. But now, with distance, the phrase felt different. It wasn't flippant, it wasn't denial, it was framing. Ethan wanted the story to be about my collapse. A party flipped that on its head. Celebrations didn't belong to women who were unraveling. Calm announcements didn't align with instability. Joy didn't support fear-based narratives. I closed my eyes and let the idea settle. A narrow escape party wouldn't mention Ethan. It wouldn't mention Claire. It wouldn't explain anything. It would simply exist. And that was precisely what made it dangerous to them. I pictured how the news would land in Ethan's world, not as an accusation, but as a contradiction. People wouldn't ask, "What did Lena do wrong?" They'd ask, "Why is she celebrating?" Questions were the enemy of a controlled narrative. My phone buzzed again as if summoned by the thought. "What exactly are you telling people?" Ethan wrote. "I'm getting confused messages." Confused messages. That told me everything. His friends, his colleagues, the people on that carefully curated list were starting to notice the disconnect. The woman they'd been warned about wasn't behaving the way they'd been told she would. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my calendar and scrolled to the date that had once been circled in gold. The wedding reception venue. The deposits. The contract still active. Still under my name because Ethan had insisted it was easier that way. At the time, I'd thought it was convenience. Now it felt like leverage. I clicked through the emails from the venue coordinator, reading her polite reminders, the cheerful tone that assumed celebration was still on track. I didn't feel sadness. I felt opportunity. The space was already paid for. The date was still reserved. The infrastructure for a gathering already existed. All it needed was a new purpose. I drafted an email, paused, deleted it, then started again. I'd like to repurpose the event. The words felt solid, neutral, professional. Before sending it, I hesitated, a familiar voice rising in my head. The old instinct. Is this too much? What will people think? Are you making a mistake? I recognized that voice now. It wasn't mine. I hit send. The response came faster than I expected. "I'm sorry to hear about the change," the coordinator wrote, "but yes, we can absolutely adjust the event. What did you have in mind?" I smiled. "A celebration of new beginnings," I typed back. That was all. Over the next few days, I worked quietly, not obsessively, methodically. I didn't announce anything publicly. I didn't explain my silence. I simply continued with my life, making choices without checking how they might land in Ethan's world. That restraint was the hardest part. Not reacting, not clarifying, not correcting rumors as they floated back to me through mutual acquaintances. Someone texted, "Is it true you're throwing a party?" Another asked, "Are you okay?" I answered honestly, but briefly. "Yes, I'm fine, nothing more." The reactions varied. Confusion, curiosity, a few supportive messages from people who had been at the restaurant, who had seen my composure with their own eyes. "That's not what I expected," one of them admitted. Exactly, I thought. Ethan's messages returned, sharper now. "This is getting out of hand. You're making things public when they don't need to be." Public. The irony almost made me laugh. He'd chosen a crowded restaurant, invited witnesses, arranged recordings. Now he was concerned about privacy. I finally replied, choosing each word carefully. "I'm not making anything public. I'm living my life." There was a long pause before his response arrived. "You're trying to embarrass me." That was the closest he'd come to telling the truth. I set the phone down and walked to the window, watching the late afternoon light spill across the street. Cars passed. People moved through their lives, unaware of the careful recalibration happening behind the scenes. Ethan needed me quiet and hidden or loud and emotional. Either one worked for him. What he couldn't handle was visibility without chaos. That was when I understood the real power of the party. It wasn't confrontation. It wasn't exposure. It was contrast. Let people see me as I was now. Let them compare it to the story they'd been told. Let them do the math themselves. No accusations, no explanations, just presence. That evening, my mother called. "I heard something interesting today," she said cautiously. "Oh?" "Claire mentioned you're planning some kind of celebration." I could hear the uncertainty in her voice, the careful way she was choosing her words. I braced myself for concern, for worry, for the familiar suggestion that I slow down, be careful, not stir things up. Instead, she surprised me. "I think that sounds strong," she said. Unexpected, but strong. I closed my eyes, relief washing over me. "I'm not trying to hurt anyone," I said. "I just don't want to disappear." "You're not," she replied softly. "And you never were." After we hung up, I sat with that for a long time. The realization that the people who truly knew me didn't need explanations. They didn't need proof. They recognized me because I was still myself. The next message from Ethan came late that night. We should meet, face to face, before things go any further. I read it once, then again. He wasn't asking to talk. He was asking to regain ground. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened my notebook and wrote a new heading beneath the others. Moment. I didn't fill it in yet. I didn't need to. I knew the timing mattered as much as the action. Too early, and it would look reactionary. Too late, and the story might settle without me. But the window was opening. I closed the notebook and leaned back, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Control. Not over Ethan. Not over Claire. Over myself. He had planned my humiliation in public, counting on my pain to justify his choices. So, I decided to reclaim myself the same way. In public. I walked into the venue for the first time alone on a quiet weekday morning, the ballroom empty except for a few staff members adjusting chairs. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting soft rectangles across the polished floor. This was the room Ethan had chosen for our wedding reception. The room he said reflected who we were supposed to be. Standing there now, I felt none of the grief I'd expected. No ache, no nostalgia. Just a clear, steady sense of ownership. This space didn't belong to a future that had been taken from me. It belonged to whatever I decided to build next. The coordinator greeted me with professional warmth, her expression carefully neutral. She didn't ask why the wedding was canceled. She didn't ask what had happened. She simply asked how she could help. "I want to reframe the event," I said. "Same date, same space, different meaning." She smiled, intrigued. "Tell me more." As we walked through the room, I pointed out changes. No white linens, no traditional seating. I wanted warmth, color, movement. I wanted the room to feel alive, not ceremonial. She nodded, making notes, clearly energized by the shift. "What should we call it?" she asked. I didn't hesitate. "A celebration of clarity." The words settled into the room easily, like they'd been waiting for me to say them. Over the next few days, preparations moved forward quietly. I didn't announce anything publicly. I didn't post online. I didn't send mass messages explaining my intentions. I let information travel the way it always does in tight social circles. Organically, imperfectly. The invitations were simple. No drama, no explanation. Just an image of an open door and a single line of text. "Please join me in celebrating a new beginning." My name, the date, the location, nothing else. The first responses came quickly. "Are you okay? Is this a joke? Good for you." Curiosity followed confusion. Confusion softened into interest. I could almost hear the collective recalibration happening as people tried to fit this new information into the story they'd already been told. My phone buzzed late one afternoon with a message from someone who had been at the restaurant. "I don't understand," she wrote. "You seem fine." I smiled at the screen. "I am." That evening, Ethan finally called. I let it ring. Then, against my better judgment, I answered. "What are you doing?" he asked without greeting. "I'm living my life," I said evenly. "You're throwing a party," he snapped. "Do you have any idea how that looks?" The question hung between us, loaded. "I do," I replied. "That's why I'm doing it." There was a pause, sharp and uncomfortable. "People think you're not taking this seriously," he said. "That's interesting," I replied, "because I've never taken myself more seriously." He exhaled sharply. "You're making people uncomfortable, Lena." I almost laughed. The irony was staggering. He had humiliated me in a crowded restaurant, orchestrated witnesses, arranged recordings. And now my composure made people uncomfortable. "I'm not responsible for how people feel about my choices," I said. "I spent years trying to be. I'm done with that." "You're spiraling," he said, the familiar accusation sliding into place. This is exactly what I was afraid of. I felt nothing, no anger, no urge to defend myself. "If that's what you believe," I said, "then there's nothing more to discuss." I hung up before he could respond. The next message came from Claire. "Can we talk privately?" I don't think this is the right way to handle things. The word privately stood out. It always did. Privately meant controlled. Privately meant no witnesses, no contrast, no accountability. I didn't answer. Instead, I focused on the details. Music selection, lighting, food that felt indulgent rather than formal. I chose bold colors Ethan had once dismissed as too much. I leaned into my own taste, the parts of myself I'd tucked away to keep the peace. Each decision felt like reclaiming something small but essential. As the date approached, the energy around the party shifted. What had started as quiet curiosity grew into something more charged. People talked, compared notes, asked questions. And when they asked me, I answered honestly without elaboration. "He ended things publicly," I said. "I chose to move forward." No embellishment, no accusations. The simplicity unsettled people more than any dramatic story would have. Ethan, on the other hand, was unraveling. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd been calling people constantly, trying to get ahead of whatever he thought I was planning. He framed the party as evidence of my instability, told people I was acting out, that I hadn't processed what happened yet. "She's having some kind of breakdown," he reportedly said. "Just wait, it'll hit her." But the problem with that narrative was that it required time. And with each passing day, I remained steady, calm, focused. That dissonance grew louder. Claire's behavior shifted too. At first, she stayed silent, perhaps hoping the situation would resolve itself without her involvement. Then, when the invitations circulated more widely, she started reaching out indirectly, asking mutual friends what I'd said, what I was telling people. Whether I seemed angry, I wasn't angry. That was the part neither of them could understand. Anger would have been easier to explain. A week before the party, my mother called again. "I've been getting calls," she admitted, "questions, concerns." "And?" I asked gently. "And I keep telling them the same thing," she said, "that you seem grounded, clear, not at all like what Ethan described." I closed my eyes, a quiet gratitude settling over me. "He told people you were fragile," she continued, "that he was afraid of how you'd react." "I know," I said. "Well," she said firmly, "that's not the daughter I raised." When we hung up, I sat in the silence for a moment, letting that sink in. The party wasn't just unsettling Ethan's story. It was forcing people to reassess their assumptions, to reconcile what they'd been told with what they were seeing. That was the real shift. 2 days before the event, I received a message from someone I hadn't expected. One of Ethan's friend's partners, someone who had been at the restaurant. "I owe you an apology," she wrote. "I didn't realize what was happening that day. I thought we were there to support him." "Now I'm not so sure." I typed back, "Thank you for saying that. No lecture, no vindication, just acknowledgement." By the night before the party, the air felt charged, not tense, anticipatory. I stood in my apartment, dress laid out on the bed, shoes beside it. Not a wedding dress, nothing symbolic, just something that made me feel like myself. My phone buzzed one last time. Ethan. I heard you're really going through with this. I stared at the message for a long moment before replying. I am. His response came quickly. People are watching, Lena. Be careful what you do next. I smiled. People were watching. That much was true. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of being seen. Because this time I wasn't performing. I was ready. They thought the party meant I was unraveling. In reality, it meant I was prepared. The questions didn't come all at once. They crept in quietly, slipping through side doors Ethan hadn't thought to guard. It started with a text from an old coworker I hadn't spoken to in months. Someone who'd been at the restaurant, seated 2 tables away. Can I ask you something? What actually happened that day? I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling the familiar urge to over-explain rise in my chest, to justify, to soften, to manage the other person's reaction before it even happened. Then I let that urge pass. He ended our engagement publicly at a crowded lunch, I typed. He had friends there. Some of them were recording. I stood up and left. That was it. No emotional commentary, no accusations, just facts. There was a long pause before the reply came back. Yeah, she wrote. That's how I remember it too. Something shifted then. Subtle, but undeniable. The story Ethan had been telling required everyone else's memory to blur. It depended on people doubting what they'd seen in favor of what they'd been told afterward. But memory is stubborn when it's anchored to a moment of shock. Over the next 2 days, similar messages arrived. From distant relatives, from acquaintances, from people connected loosely enough to Ethan's circle that they'd heard his version first, then paused when something didn't quite line up. You seem okay, one woman wrote. Not like how he described. Another asked, he said he was afraid of your reaction. But you just left? Yes, I replied. I did. Each exchange followed the same pattern. I didn't defend myself. I didn't volunteer information. I answered only what was asked, plainly and calmly, and each time I felt the ground shift a little more beneath the narrative Ethan had tried to cement. The truth didn't need volume. It needed consistency. The most interesting conversations weren't the ones happening directly with me, though. They were happening around me, out of reach, filtering back through fragments and second-hand accounts. I heard that 2 of Ethan's friends had started arguing about the lunch. One insisted Ethan had warned them I might lose it. The other pointed out that I hadn't done anything remotely close to that. She thanked him, someone reported. She just stood up and left. That detail mattered. Gratitude didn't fit instability. Calm departure didn't fit fear. Ethan sensed it before I did. His calls increased, not to me, but to everyone else. He tried to get ahead of the growing confusion by explaining harder, elaborating, filling in gaps that hadn't existed before. Every explanation added another layer that had to be remembered, defended, and repeated. That was his mistake. The more complex his story became, the more brittle it was. One evening, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. This is Jennifer, Kevin's wife. I was there that Saturday. I remembered her. She'd been seated with Ethan's friends, laughing uncomfortably when things turned strange. I hadn't thought much about her since. I don't know if this is appropriate, she continued, but I can't stop thinking about how you handled yourself. It didn't match what we were told. What were you told? I typed. There was a pause. That you were emotional. That you'd been unstable lately. That Ethan needed witnesses in case things went badly. My stomach tightened, not with surprise, but with confirmation. And did it go badly? I asked. No, she replied, that's the thing. It didn't. We exchanged a few more messages, careful, tentative. She admitted she hadn't known about the recording, hadn't known about Claire beforehand, had believed she was there to support a friend through a difficult but necessary conversation. Now, she said, she wasn't sure what to think. You don't have to think anything, I replied. I just wanted to tell the truth when asked. When I set the phone down, I realized something else had shifted. I wasn't trying to clear my name anymore. I was letting people draw their own conclusions. And when people do that, they're far more invested in the result. Claire, meanwhile, was unraveling in a quieter way. She stopped messaging me directly and started reaching out through others, testing the waters, trying to see what I was saying. When mutual friends told her I wasn't saying much at all, just answering questions calmly, her anxiety spiked. I heard she'd told someone, "It's complicated. You don't understand." Complicated is what people say when the simple truth doesn't favor them. Someone else reported that, when asked directly whether she'd known beforehand, Claire hesitated too long. That silence had spoken louder than any denial could have. Ethan's behavior grew more erratic. He sent me a message late one night. "I don't recognize you anymore. You're acting cold. This isn't who you are." I read it once and deleted it. The next morning, another message followed. "People are twisting things. You need to help me fix this. Fix this." As if the problem were a technical glitch rather than his own actions coming into focus.